Metaphysics in Politics, a philosophical exploration of ideological foundations. Introduction. Unveiling the invisible threads of reality and governance. In the vast tapestry of human society, politics emerges not merely as a pragmatic arena for power distribution, resource allocation, and conflict resolution, but as a profound reflection of our deepest assumptions about the nature of existence itself. At its core, every political ideology is underpinned by a metaphysical framework, a set of beliefs concerning the fundamental structure of reality, the origins of being, and the relationship between the material world and any potential transcendent dimensions. Provided is a comprehensive examination of metaphysics in politics, positing that ideological spectra can be logically reframed not solely through lenses of economic equity, individual liberty, or authoritarian control, but through the degree to which metaphysical constructs inform and justify governance. By doing so, we uncover how philosophical premises about reality shape the architectures of societies, from egalitarian collectives to hierarchical imperiums, in a manner that is both objective and grounded in reasoned analysis. To lay the groundwork, consider the historical interplay between metaphysics and politics. Since antiquity, thinkers have grappled with questions of ontology, the study of being, and epistemology, the study of knowledge, to inform their visions of an ideal polity. Plato's Republic, for instance, envisions a state governed by philosopher kings, attuned to the eternal forms, eternal metaphysical ideals transcending the sensory world, thereby justifying a stratified society where rulers access higher truths. In contrast, Aristotle's more empirical approach in politics emphasizes observable natural hierarchies, blending metaphysical teleology, purpose-driven existence, with practical governance. Fast-forwarding through the Enlightenment, figures like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke invoked metaphysical notions of the state of nature, Hobbes viewing it as materialist war of all against all, necessitating absolute sovereignty, while Locke posited natural rights derived from a divine creator, laying the foundation for limited government. These examples illustrate a logical pattern. Metaphysical assumptions provide the rational scaffolding for political legitimacy, whether through divine ordination, material determinism, or humanistic reason. In modern contexts, this interplay persists, often implicitly. Ideologies on one end of the spectrum embrace total atheistic materialism, positing that reality is exhaustively composed of physical matter and energy, governed by causal laws discoverable through science and reason, with no recourse to supernatural or transcendent entities. This worldview, epitomized by thinkers like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, logically leads to political systems focused on tangible economic relations and class dynamics, viewing history as a dialectical progression driven by material forces rather than spiritual interventions. On the opposing end, political structures are explicitly based on metaphysical constructs, where governance derives authority from higher realities, be it a divine creator, a cosmic hierarchy, or an esoteric perennial tradition. Here, as articulated by philosophers like Julius Evola or the Theocratic models, the state mirrors an eternal order, justifying hierarchies as reflections of immutable truths beyond human invention. This reframed spectrum, ranging from atheistic materialism to metaphysically grounded states, serves as the organizing principle for our exploration. It allows for an objective mapping of ideologies, categorizing them not by subjective labels of left or right, but by their logical engagement with metaphysical depth. For instance, far materialist ideologies prioritizing empirical equity and human autonomy often result in an anti-hierarchical or collectivist arrangement that assumes societal progress stems from rational reorganization of material conditions. Centrist positions, such as both secular and traditional liberalism, maintain a neutral stance relying on humanistic rationalism while privatizing metaphysical questions. In contrast, metaphysically oriented systems integrate transcendent principles into the fabric of authority, positing that true order arises from alignment with non-material realities, which rationally underpins stratified or absolutist governance. The value of this approach lies in its logical neutrality. By focusing on metaphysical foundations, we avoid partisan biases and instead evaluate each ideology through reasoned criteria, such as internal consistency, historical manifestations, and implications for human flourishing. Does a purely materialist view adequately account for moral universals, or does it risk relativism? Conversely, can metaphysically justified hierarchies prevent arbitrary power from descending into dogma? These questions, explored objectively, reveal politics as an extension of philosophy, where metaphysical premises dictate not only what societies build, but why they endure or falter. As we proceed, let's delineate the spectrum in detail. From ideologies anchored in atheistic materialism, such as Anarchism, Communism, Socialism, and Democratic Socialism, to those emphasizing centrist rationalism, including secular and traditional liberalism, and those predicated on metaphysical constructs, including Theocratic Monarchy, Fascism, and Aristocratic Imperium. Each section will provide an objective overview grounded in logical analysis of their philosophical bases, social structures, and rational distinctions from counterparts. Through this grand inquiry, we aim to illustrate how metaphysics, often the unseen architect of politics, shapes the human quest for order in an uncertain cosmos, fostering a deeper understanding that transcends ideological divides. Metaphysics in Politics, a philosophical exploration of ideological foundations, Part 2. Theocratic Monarchy, divine sanction as the primordial model of ordered society. As we commence our detailed traversal of the metaphysical spectrum in politics, beginning, per historical precedents, with one of the earliest and most enduring forms among those examined, theocratic monarchy stands as a foundational archetype. Emerging in ancient civilizations such as Mesopotamia, Egypt, and early Israel, this system predates the more modern ideologies in our framework by millennia, logically deriving its structure from a worldview where human authority is an extension of divine will. Objectively, theocratic monarchy posits that governance is not a human invention born of contract or consciousness, but a hierarchical emanation from a transcendent creator, ensuring societal harmony through alignment with eternal laws. This placement at the metaphysical end of our spectrum is rational, as it fully integrates non-material realities, such as a god or divine order, into the state's legitimacy, contrasting sharply with materialist alternatives that view such constructs as superfluous or illusory. Metaphysically, theocratic monarchy is rooted in theism, affirming a universe governed by a supreme transcendent entity whose decrees form the basis of all existence. Logically, this foundation assumes a great chain of being, where the monarch serves as God's earthly vicar, channeling divine authority to maintain cosmic balance. Historical exemplars, like the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, who were considered incarnations of Horus, or the divine right kings of medieval Europe, illustrate this. The ruler's power is not arbitrary, but ontologically justified, derived from sacred text or revelations that posit hierarchy as a reflection of heavenly order. Rationally, this worldview addresses existential questions of purpose and morality by subordinating human reason to divine wisdom, positing that without such a transcendent anchor, society risks chaos or moral relativism. Yet it presupposes the accuracy of religious interpretations, relying on clergy or institutions to mediate between the divine and the temporal, which logically introduces potential for human error or institutional bias. Socially and politically, theocratic monarchy organizes society in a rigid top-down hierarchy, with the monarch at the apex, supported by religious authorities who interpret and enforce sacred laws. Decision-making flows from divine mandates, such as Sharia in Islamic caliphates or biblical precepts in Judeo-Christian models, regulating aspects from economy to personal conduct to uphold moral purity. Citizens' roles are defined by communal duties tied to faith, with limited individual autonomy subordinated to the collective alignment with transcendent principles. Enforcement relies on absolute rule, blending royal decrees with clerical oversight. Logically, this structure promotes stability by providing a unified ethical framework, assuming that divine laws offer timeless guidance superior to human variability. However, it rationally depends on widespread acceptance of the faith to avoid coercion, as dissent might be framed as heresy rather than legitimate critique. In distinguishing theocratic monarchy from other metaphysically oriented ideologies on our spectrum, its explicit theism sets it apart, versus fascism, which secularizes transcendence by elevating the nation-state as a quasi-spiritual entity with its own will to power. Theocracy remains faith-centric, deriving authority from a specific deity rather than national myths or charismatic leaders. Rationally, this makes theocracy more doctrinally rigid, focused on religious orthodoxy, while fascism is pragmatic and mass mobilizing. Compared to an aristocratic imperium, also known as traditional imperium, theocracy is clergy-mediated and tied to organized religion, whereas the former emphasizes esoteric, warrior elitist initiation beyond institutional faith, critiquing theocracy for potential passivity or egalitarianism within the believer community. On the broader spectrum, it contrasts with materialist systems like communism, which reject divine hierarchies as tools of oppression, logically favoring empirical class analysis over spiritual mandates. Even centrist secular liberalism privatizes religion, viewing it as incompatible with neutral governance. Objectively evaluating its implications, theocratic monarchy's strength lies in its logical provision of moral coherence, where transcendent ethics foster social unity and long-term continuity, as evidenced by the millennia-spanning durability of such systems. Rationally, it addresses human needs for meaning by integrating governance with ultimate questions of existence, potentially reducing alienation in fragmented societies. However, this integration risks logical pitfalls. If divine interpretations are contested, it may justify suppression of pluralism, leading to stagnation or conflict, as historical inquisitions or modern religious enforcements demonstrate. Without mechanisms for adaptation, it could falter in diverse or secularizing contexts, though its metaphysical grounding offers a reasoned counter to purely utilitarian politics by emphasizing accountability to a higher order. This examination of theocratic monarchy as the entry into metaphysically grounded ideologies underscores how ancient philosophical commitments continue to inform modern governance, setting the stage for comparative analysis with its hierarchical counterparts and the spectrum's materialist origins. Metaphysics in Politics, a philosophical exploration of ideological foundations, Part 3. From hierarchical transcendence to tempered liberty, the evolution toward traditional liberalism. Having established theocratic monarchy as a primordial exemplar of metaphysically grounded governance, where divine sanction provides an ontological basis for hierarchical order, we now transition to ideologies that begin to moderate this absolute integration of transcendence with state authority. This shift logically emerges from historical upheavals that challenge monarchical absolutism, prompting a reevaluation of metaphysics in politics toward frameworks that balance individual autonomy with ethical traditions. Objectively, such evolutions reflect a rational response to the tensions inherent in theocratic systems. While divine hierarchies offer moral unity, they can stifle pluralism and adaptation, leading to revolutions that seek to redistribute power without wholly abandoning transcendent anchors. The French Revolution exemplifies this dynamic, overthrowing the divine right monarchy in favor of republican ideals inspired by Enlightenment rationalism, yet inadvertently paving the way for secular excesses like the Reign of Terror. Similarly, across history, monarchies have been supplanted by governments emphasizing constitutional limits, individual rights, and varying degrees of metaphysical neutrality. These transitions underscore a logical progression. As societies grapple with the limitations of imposed divine order, they gravitate toward systems that incorporate tradition as a voluntary ethical guide rather than a coercive mandate. Within this continuum, traditional liberalism occupies a pivotal position on our metaphysical spectrum, bridging the neutral rationalism of secular liberalism with the transcendent hierarchies of the far right. Metaphysically, it draws from a moderate theism or natural law philosophy, viewing individual liberties as derived from enduring principles, often rooted in Judeo-Christian ethics or historical wisdom, that transcend mere human convention but do not necessitate state-enforced religion. Logically, this foundation posits that reality encompasses both material and moral dimensions, where rights such as life, liberty, and property are self-evident truths endowed by a higher order, as articulated in foundational texts like the Declaration of Independence. Influenced by thinkers such as Edmund Burke, traditional liberalism rationally tempers the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason with respect for organic traditions, arguing that abrupt changes risk societal disintegration by severing connections to metaphysical anchors like virtue and community. Socially and politically, traditional liberalism structures society around limited government, constitutional safeguards, and civil institutions that foster self-reliance while encouraging moral formation through voluntary associations such as families, churches, and local communities. Governance involves representative democracy with checks and balances, minimal state intervention in personal affairs, and an ethical capitalism constrained by norms against exploitation. The quintessential embodiment of traditional liberalism's metaphysical nuance is the United States Constitution, which emerged from the American Revolution's overthrow of monarchical rule and sought to establish a republic grounded in rational design, yet informed by moral traditions. Objectively, the Constitution's framers created a federal system with enumerated powers, a Bill of Rights protecting individual freedoms, and mechanisms like federalism to diffuse authority. Metaphysically, it implicitly acknowledges transcendent ethics without establishing religion. The preamble's invocation of the blessings of liberty and the Declaration's reference to a creator suggest a foundation in divine or natural law, yet the First Amendment prohibits state endorsement of faith, privatizing metaphysics to preserve pluralism. Logically, this balance addresses the pitfalls of theocratic monarchy by limiting government to secular functions while assuming citizens' moral self-regulation, enabling a diverse society to cohere without divine mandates. This assumption is poignantly captured in John Adams' reflections on the Constitution's fragility. To quote Adams, "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." Here Adams rationally highlights traditional liberalism's metaphysical reliance. Without an internalized ethical framework, often derived from religious traditions, the system's institutional cords prove insufficient against human flaws. Objectively, this underscores the ideology's logical distinction from secular liberalism, which prioritizes neutral reason alone, potentially risking moral relativism. Traditional liberalism integrates such anchors to sustain liberty, viewing them as essential for voluntary order. In comparative terms, traditional liberalism differentiates from theocratic monarchy by rejecting absolute divine rule in favor of limited consensual governance, where metaphysics informs personal virtue rather than state coercion. Versus fascism or aristocratic imperium, it upholds pluralism and individualism, avoiding total subordination to national or elitist transcendence. On the materialist side, it contrasts with socialism's state-driven equity by defending private property as a natural right. Rationally, its strengths include adaptability and moral depth, fostering innovation while mitigating chaos. Yet, if traditions erode without active cultivation, it may drift towards secular atomization, as contemporary debates over cultural secularization illustrate. This exploration of traditional liberalism as a moderated metaphysical bridge illuminates how historical revolts against monarchy birthed systems that retained ethical transcendence in subtler forms, setting the foundation for a continued journey along the spectrum. Metaphysics in Politics, a philosophical exploration of ideological foundations, Part 4, The Pivot to Neutral Rationalism, Secular Liberalism as the Spectrum's Centrist Fulcrum. With traditional liberalism illustrating a moderated incorporation of metaphysical ethics, drawing from historical traditions to underpin limited government and individual liberties, as exemplified in the U.S. Constitution's reliance on moral self-regulation, we now advance along the spectrum to ideologies that further attenuate transcendent commitments in favor of empirical neutrality. This transition logically arises from the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason over revelation, where revolutions against monarchical and theocratic absolutism not only decentralized power, but also secularized it, prioritizing universal human faculties as the basis for governance. Objectively, such shifts reflect a rational adaptation to increasing societal diversity and scientific progress. As metaphysical unanimity waned in pluralistic contexts, political systems evolved to accommodate varied beliefs without privileging any, ensuring stability through consensual institutions rather than inherited hierarchies. The aftermath of the French Revolution, for instance, saw the rise of secular republics that balanced liberty with equality, influencing global models where reason supplants divine mandate as the arbiter of justice. Positioned as the centrist pivot in our metaphysical spectrum, secular liberalism embodies this neutral stance, emphasizing individual rights, rational governance, and market-driven economies while deliberately bracketing transcendent questions from public policy. Metaphysically, it is grounded in empiricism and humanism, drawing from Enlightenment rationalism to view reality as accessible through science, dialogue, and observable evidence, without mandating religious or spiritual frameworks. Logically, this foundation assumes that truth and ethics can be derived from shared human reason, treating metaphysical claims as private matters to foster tolerance. Rationally, this neutrality addresses the limitations of traditional liberalism's ethical traditions. By privatizing religion, it prevents sectarian conflicts, positing that a secular framework better accommodates diverse worldviews in modern societies, though it risks deriving moral universals solely from consensus, potentially leading to relativism if reason alone proves insufficient for absolute values. Socially and politically, secular liberalism organizes society around representative democracy, the rule of law, and regulated free markets, with institutions designed to protect minorities and promote opportunity through pluralism. Governance features elections, checks and balances, and welfare provisions for social mobility, but without extensive collectivization or hierarchical impositions. Individuals enjoy rights to free speech, assembly, and property, enforced by neutral courts and parliaments, while economic activity emphasizes meritocracy and innovation, with safety nets to mitigate inequalities. Logically, this structure assumes that rational self-interest, mediated by institutions, generates progress and harmony. It rationally balances liberty with equity by using empirical data to refine systems, though this depends on participants' commitment to procedural fairness over substantive metaphysical ends. Distinguishing secular liberalism from adjacent ideologies highlights its equilibrium. Versus traditional liberalism, it eschews overt metaphysical anchors like Judeo-Christian ethics, relying instead on neutral reason to ground rights, which allows greater progressivism but may dilute moral cohesion. Compared to democratic socialism on the materialist side, it permits market inequalities as incentives for growth, resisting state-led redistribution that could infringe on individual autonomy. On the far right, it rejects theocratic or fascist transcendence, viewing such integrations as threats to pluralism. Rationally, its neutrality promotes inclusivity, though critics argue it fosters cultural fragmentation by lacking a unifying higher purpose. Secular liberalism's strengths include its adaptability and promotion of innovation, as empirical rationalism enables evidence-based reforms in diverse societies, evidenced by its dominance in Western democracies. Logically, it mitigates theocratic risks of dogma by emphasizing tolerance, yet this same neutrality may encounter challenges in addressing profound existential needs, potentially leading to atomization or vulnerability to extremist ideologies if metaphysical voids persist. This centrist position thus serves as a rational bridge, illuminating how the spectrum's metaphysical gradient influences governance from transcendent hierarchies to materialist critiques as we proceed to the leftward evolutions. Metaphysics in Politics, a philosophical exploration of ideological foundations, Part 5. The leftward tilt toward ethical collectivism, democratic socialism as a reformist hybrid. As secular liberalism establishes a neutral reason-based equilibrium, privileging empirical pluralism and institutional safeguards to mediate diverse worldviews without transcendent mandates, we progress further along the metaphysical spectrum into territories that increasingly emphasize materialist critiques of inequality while retaining democratic openness. This shift logically stems from the industrial era's social upheavals, where rapid urbanization and economic disparities expose the limitations of unregulated markets, prompting ideologies that blend liberal freedoms with collective interventions. Objectively, such evolutions represent a rational response to secular liberalism's potential for exacerbating inequities. By incorporating ethical humanism, these systems seek to humanize capitalism through gradual reforms, addressing tangible societal needs without resorting to revolutionary ruptures or hierarchical absolutes. The rise of labor movements in the 19th and 20th centuries, for example, influenced policies in Europe and North America that expanded welfare states, illustrating how democratic mechanisms can integrate materialist concerns for equity into governance. Occupying a moderate position on the materialist side of our spectrum, democratic socialism integrates leftist economic goals with liberal democratic processes, advocating for social ownership of essential sectors through electoral means while preserving individual rights and pluralism. Metaphysically, it is anchored in secular humanism and ethical rationalism, rooted in Enlightenment values of progress and justice, with a materialist analysis of inequality tempered by democratic ideals. This foundation prioritizes empirical social science and human empathy as drivers of societal improvement, viewing flourishing as achievable through collective reason rather than divine order, though it remains open to moral frameworks from philosophy or religion without mandating them. This partial openness distinguishes it from a purer form of materialism. It assumes ethical norms can emerge from shared human values, enabling reforms that balance individual autonomy with communal welfare, but it risks grounding justice in contingent consensus if transcendent anchors are absent. Socially and politically, democratic socialism structures society around a robust welfare state, progressive taxation, and public control of key industries like healthcare and education, achieved via parliamentary democracy, unions, and multi-party elections. Private enterprise persists in non-essential domains, regulated to ensure fair distribution and worker protections, fostering a mixed economy that mitigates capitalism's excesses without full expropriation. Governance is participatory and evolutionary, emphasizing policies for social mobility and environmental sustainability. Logically, this arrangement posits that democratic safeguards can prevent coercive overreach, assuming gradual socialization enhances equity through consensus. However, it rationally depends on electoral majorities to sustain reforms, potentially vulnerable to market pressures or political gridlock. In delineating democratic socialism from neighboring ideologies, its reformist hybridity emerges clearly. Versus secular liberalism, it pushes for greater state intervention to address structural inequalities, viewing markets as insufficiently neutral without collective oversight, though both share a commitment to pluralism and reason. Compared to socialism proper, it retains democratic institutions and market elements for evolutionary change, eschewing abrupt nationalization. Rationally, this makes it less radical, prioritizing peaceful transitions over revolutionary mandates. On the farther materialist end, it rejects communism's proletarian dictatorship and anarchism's immediate statelessness, favoring institutional channels to achieve equity. From the right, it contrasts with traditional liberalism's minimalism by subordinating individual property rights to social needs, and with theocratic monarchies' divine hierarchies by secularizing ethics. Objectively assessing its ramifications, democratic socialism's logical appeal lies in its balanced adaptability, using empirical evidence to refine policies that promote broad prosperity, as demonstrated by high human development indices in implementing nations. Rationally, it mitigates secular liberalism's risk of inequality by embedding ethical collectivism, fostering social cohesion without total control. Nevertheless, this integration may encounter challenges. If materialist priorities overshadow individual incentives, it could stifle innovation. Or if democratic processes falter, lead to bureaucratic inefficiencies, though its pluralistic safeguards generally avert extremes. This ideology thus exemplifies the spectrum's materialist gradient, bridging rational neutrality with collective critiques, as we continue toward more uncompromising forms. Metaphysics in Politics, a philosophical exploration of ideological foundations, Part 6, The Deepening Materialist Critique, Socialism as an Intermediate Collectivist Stage. Following democratic socialism's reformist integration of ethical humanism with democratic processes, Seeking gradual equity through electoral means while preserving pluralism, we delve deeper into the materialist side of the metaphysical spectrum, where ideologies prioritize empirical analysis of economic and social forces over transcendent or rationalistic neutrality. This progression logically follows from the perceived inadequacies of mixed economies. As industrial capitalism's disparities intensified in the 19th century, thinkers advocated for a more comprehensive state intervention to address systemic inequalities, viewing material conditions as the primary drivers of human progress. Objectively, this shift represents a rational extension of democratic socialism's principles, moving from evolutionary reforms to structured collectivization, yet without the revolutionary absolutism of farther extremes. Historical developments, such as the rise of trade unions and early welfare experiments in Europe, exemplify how socialism emerged as a bridge, influencing policies that nationalize industries to mitigate market failures without fully dismantling private incentives. As an intermediate category on our materialist end, socialism advocates for collective or state ownership of key production means to ensure social welfare and reduce inequality, serving as a precursor to more radical variants like communism and anarchism. Metaphysically, it is primarily grounded in materialist critiques of society, influenced by Enlightenment rationalism and early Marxist dialectics, which emphasize historical and economic determinism over spiritual or divine elements. This foundation focuses on tangible disparities in the material world, deriving egalitarian principles from reason and empathy rather than transcendent hierarchies. Though not strictly atheistic, it often aligns with secular humanism, viewing progress as attainable through social reform without recourse to higher powers. Rationally, this approach assumes that ethical norms arise from observable human needs and class relations, enabling a systematic redistribution that addresses exploitation. However, it presupposes that centralized planning can efficiently mirror these dynamics, potentially overlooking the complexities of individual motivations if metaphysical anchors for personal dignity are sidelined. Socially and politically, socialism organizes society through public or worker-controlled management of industries, with the state or cooperatives handling distribution for the common good via planning committees, unions, or democratic processes. This involves progressive taxation, nationalization of resources, and welfare provisions to foster a classless trajectory, ranging from market-inclusive variants to centralized models like Soviet-style planning. Governance can blend democratic elements with institutional authority, aiming for equity through regulated allocation. Logically, the structure posits that collective ownership rectifies capitalism's inefficiencies, assuming state mechanisms enhance welfare without undue coercion. Yet, it rationally hinges on effective administration to avoid bureaucratic inertia or resource misallocation. Distinguishing socialism from contiguous ideologies clarifies its transitional role. Versus democratic socialism, it commits more fully to collective ownership and planning, potentially bypassing markets or elections for direct implementation, making it less reformist and more structural. Compared to communism, socialism is often viewed as a milder phase, retaining elements like money or state apparatus for transition, whereas communism demands revolutionary abolition of classes and the state. On the anarchism front, socialism employs state tools for equity, which anarchists reject as inherently coercive, favoring voluntary decentralization instead. From the centrist right, it contrasts with secular liberalism's market individualism by subordinating personal enterprise to group mandates, and with traditional liberalism's ethical traditions by prioritizing material reform over moral heritage. Socialism's logical merits includes its focus on empirical equity, providing frameworks for addressing widespread disparities through coordinated efforts. Rationally, it extends materialist critiques to promote collective flourishing, countering individualism's potential for exploitation. Nonetheless, this emphasis may face challenges. Without transcendent ethics, it could justify coercive measures against perceived obstacles, leading to authoritarian drifts, though its reformist strains often incorporate safeguards to mitigate against such risks. This ideology thus marks a deepening of the spectrum's materialist orientation, facilitating our examination of its radical offshoots. Metaphysics in Politics, A Philosophical Exploration of Ideological Foundations, Part 7. The Radical Branching of Materialism. Anarchism as Voluntary Anti-Authoritarianism. As socialism represents an intermediate stage of materialist collectivism, employing state or cooperative mechanisms to address economic disparities through structured planning, we encounter the spectrum's far materialist extremes, where ideologies diverge into radical critiques that either abolish or temporarily harness authority to achieve classless societies. This bifurcation logically arises from socialism's inherent tensions. While it relies on institutional power for equity, historical implementations have often perpetuated hierarchies, prompting alternatives that either intensify state control for revolutionary ends or reject it outright in favor of decentralized autonomy. This progression reflects a rational exploration of materialism's implications. If reality is reducible to empirical forces in human relations, then optimal governments might dispense with coercive structures altogether, assuming voluntary cooperation can sustain complex societies. Anarchism, as one branch, exemplifies this anti-statist impulse. Positioned alongside communism in the far atheistic materialist category of our spectrum, anarchism fundamentally rejects hierarchical authority, including the state, capitalism, and other coercive institutions, in favor of voluntary, decentralized cooperation among individuals or communities. Metaphysically, it is typically grounded in a materialist or humanist worldview, prioritizing empirical reason, natural law, or evolutionary mutualism over transcendent entities. Logically, this foundation denies metaphysical hierarchies or divine orders, viewing them as alienating constructs that undermine human freedom, and equating God and the state as twin oppressors. The dominant threads remain secular and anti-authoritarian, assuming reality is shaped by human autonomy and solidarity without imposed higher realities. Rationally, this approach posits that ethical norms emerge from mutual aid and rational self-interest, enabling societies to function without domination, though it presupposes widespread voluntary adherence to prevent reversion to power vacuums. Socially and politically, anarchism organizes society through voluntary associations, federations, or communes, with decision-making via direct democracy, consensus, or worker syndicates. Property is often communal or use-based, with production managed collectively to meet needs, diffusing power to avoid a ruling class. Enforcement depends on social norms, mutual accountability, and non-coercive means, though some strains endorse revolutionary action to dismantle existing structures. Anarchism's structure assumes decentralized coordination can efficiently address collective needs, countering the state's coercive inefficiencies. However, it rationally requires a robust community tied to resolving conflicts without formalized authority, which is potentially challenging in large-scale or diverse contexts. In distinguishing anarchism from other materialist ideologies, its immediate anti-statism stands out. Versus communism, both critique capitalism and aim for classless societies, but anarchism abolishes the state outright, viewing it as inherently oppressive, whereas communism employs a transitional proletarian state. Logically, this makes anarchism more purist in rejecting authority, though communism's structure offers a phased path to similar ends. Compared to socialism, anarchism opposes any state intervention, favoring bottom-up organization over institutional welfare or planning. From democratic socialism, it diverges by rejecting electoral politics and gradual reforms in favor of direct action. On the broader spectrum, it contrasts with secular liberalism's institutional individualism by eliminating governance hierarchies altogether, and with theocratic monarchy's divine order by denying transcendent justifications for authority. Anarchism's logical strengths include its emphasis on autonomy and mutualism, providing frameworks for equitable, flexible societies that adapt to local needs, fostering innovation amid crises. Rationally, it extends materialist critiques to promote genuine freedom from coercion, countering hierarchical exploitation. Nonetheless, this radicalism may encounter practical hurdles. Without mechanisms for large-scale coordination, It could fragment into conflicts or inefficiencies, though its voluntary ethos often incorporates adaptive strategies to mitigate such risks. This ideology, thus, highlights the spectrum's materialist extremity, complementing our forthcoming analysis of its revolutionary counterpart, communism. Metaphysics in Politics, a philosophical exploration of ideological foundations, Part 8. The parallel extremity of materialist revolution, communism as dialectical determinism. Complementing anarchism's voluntary anti-statism, where materialist humanism rejects all hierarchies in pursuit of immediate decentralized equity, we turn to its parallel branch in the far atheistic materialist category, communism, which shares the critique of capitalism but channels it through structured revolutionary means toward a utopian endpoint. This juxtaposition logically highlights the spectrum's divergent responses to socialism's institutionalism, where anarchism disperses power outright. Communism temporarily centralizes it to facilitate a deterministic progression, reflecting the materialist premise that historical forces inevitably drive societal transformation. Objectively, this ideology arose from the 19th century amid industrial exploitation, formalized by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in works like the Communist Manifesto, influencing global revolutions from Russia to China and Cuba, where economic disparities were framed as the root of all social ills, demanding radical overhaul. Metaphysically, communism is firmly rooted in atheistic materialism, reinterpreting Hegelian philosophy through a deterministic lens that views history as a progression towards a telos, or ultimate purpose, in the form of a classless utopia. Logically drawing from dialectical idealism, where reality unfolds through thesis, antithesis, synthesis conflicts leading to higher syntheses, Marx and Engels inverted this into dialectical materialism, positing that economic and material conditions, rather than idealist Geist, propel societal evolution. Rationally, this assumes that contradictions in capitalism will inevitably generate crises, culminating in proletarian triumph and the withering away of the state into communal harmony, without transcendent elements like God or souls, which are dismissed as ideological superstructures perpetuated by ruling classes to obscure exploitation. Reality is reduced to matter in motion, with human progress determined by productive forces and class relations. This purely atheistic viewpoint logically emphasizes economic inequality as the sole engine of change, rendering other factors, such as cultural or spiritual dimensions, secondary illusions, thereby justifying a utopian vision where needs-based distribution eradicates scarcity and alienation. Socially and politically, communism envisions a classless, stateless society with collective ownership of production and distribution according to need, but achieves this via transitional dictatorship of the proletariat to suppress opposition. In practice, this manifests as a one-party rule with centralized control over the economy, media, and life, as seen in the Soviet Union under Lenin and Stalin, or Maoist China. Logically, the structure assumes that a revolutionary vanguard can guide the dialectic toward utopia, enforcing equality through the state apparatus before it dissolves. However, it rationally depends on suppressing the bourgeoisie remnants, often leading to authoritarian persistence rather than the promised withering. The call for revolution under communism stems directly from its materialist focus on economic inequality, positing that any non-proletarian government, whether monarchical, liberal, or socialist, perpetuates class exploitation and must be overthrown to advance historical necessity. Rationally, this emphasis arises from the atheistic rejection of transcendent ethics or gradual reforms. Without divine or metaphysical restraints, inequality is viewed as an objective material contradiction, resolvable only through abrupt rupture, as incremental changes merely reinforce capitalist superstructures. Historical adaptations, like Lenin's vanguardism or Mao's cultural revolutions, exemplify this logic, targeting perceived class enemies to accelerate the telos, though this often resulted in widespread upheaval. Distinguishing communism from other materialist ideologies underscores its teleological rigor. Versus anarchism, it requires a temporary state for transition, which anarchists see as a new oppression, while communism's organized revolution contrasts anarchism's voluntary immediacy. Compared to socialism, communism demands full expropriation and utopian rupture, viewing gradualism as insufficient. From democratic socialism, it rejects pluralism for proletarian dictatorship. On the spectrum's opposite end, it opposes theocratic monarchies' divine hierarchies by atheistically dismantling all transcendent claims. Communism's logical appeal lies in its systematic analysis of inequality, offering a framework for radical equity. Rationally, its dialectical progression toward utopia addresses material injustices, yet this materialism may overlook human complexities, leading to coercive implementations that deviate from ideals. This concludes our spectrum's materialist extremity, synthesizing how metaphysical foundations, from transcendent hierarchies to atheistic determinism, shape political vision. Metaphysics in Politics, a philosophical exploration of ideological foundations, Part 9. The return to metaphysical extremes. Fascism as nationalist transcendence. Having traversed the materialist arc of our spectrum, from socialism's structured collectivism through anarchism's voluntary decentralization to communism's dialectical utopianism, we now pivot back to the far metaphysical end, where ideologies elevate transcendent constructs to justify hierarchical authority and societal renewal. This return is logically warranted, as the extremes on both sides often emerge in historical dialogue. Materialist revolutions provoke counter-movements that reassert metaphysical order, adapting ancient hierarchical principles to modern crises. Objectively, such dynamics reflect a rational interplay of philosophical worldviews, where atheistic determinism's focus on economic rupture invites responses that locate ultimate reality in immanent yet elevated entities like the nation or cosmic tradition. Fascism, as a relatively modern ideology in our framework, exemplifies this reactive genesis, arising in the early 20th century amid post-World War I turmoil and the specter of Bolshevik influence, yet embedding a distinct metaphysical component that distinguishes it from purely pragmatic authoritarianism. Metaphysically, fascism repudiates the stark materialism of communism by positing the nation-state as a transcendent organic entity, an eternal living organism embodying a collective will to power, influenced by Nietzschean vitalism and Giovanni Gentile's actual idealism. Logically, this foundation reinterprets reality as infused with spiritual depth, where the state transcends individual or material contingencies, serving as the metaphysical absolute that fuses citizens into higher destiny. Unlike theocratic monarchies' explicit divine sanction, fascism secularizes spirituality. It affirms a higher reality, but locates it in the immanent nation, often incorporating mythic or pagan elements, while subordinating organized religion to ideological ends. Rationally, this assumes historical progress arises from national vitality and conflict, countering communism's class-based dialectics with a teleological narrative of renewal through struggle. However, it presupposes the nation's inherent superiority, potentially justifying expansionism as an ontological imperative without external transcendent checks. Socially and politically, fascism organizes society as a corporate state, integrating economic sectors under centralized control to eliminate class divisions and promote national efficiency. Authority concentrates in a charismatic leader, supported by a single party enforcing loyalty via propaganda, paramilitary forces, and suppression of dissent. Emphasis on discipline, hierarchy, and martial values permeates education and culture, propagating national myths to foster unity, while imperialist policies assert the state's dynamism. Logically, this structure posits that total mobilization counters decadence from liberal individualism or communist internationalism, assuming organic fusion enhances collective strength. Yet it rationally depends on perpetual mobilization to maintain cohesion, often leading to internal purges or external aggression. Fascism's emergence as a response to communism underscores its logical positioning. In interwar Europe, the threat of proletarian revolution, exemplified by the Russian upheaval, prompted ideologies that co-opted socialist appeals to the masses while redirecting them toward nationalist transcendence, combating egalitarian materialism with hierarchical unity. Objectively, figures like Mussolini, initially a socialist, pivoted to fascism to preempt communist influence, framing it as a third way that preserved order amid economic chaos. This reactive metaphysics provided a rational alternative. By elevating the state as a spiritual entity, it addressed existential voids left by secularization, rallying populations against perceived threats without relying on divine or materialist absolutes alone. Distinguishing fascism from other metaphysical ideologies clarifies its modernist hybridity. Versus theocratic monarchy, its transcendence is nationalist and leader-driven, co-opting religion pragmatically rather than deriving from clerical divine right. Compared to aristocratic imperium, fascism is populist and mass-oriented, critiqued by Evola as too democratic and materialist, lacking pure esoteric elitism. From the materialist end, it opposes communism's class struggle by subsuming individuals into national will, rejecting atheistic determinism for idealized state worship. On the centrist spectrum, it discards secular liberalism's pluralism for totalitarian control. Viewed objectively, fascism's logical merits includes its capacity for rapid societal mobilization, as seen in economic recoveries during early regimes, offering a framework for unity in fragmented eras. Rationally, its metaphysical component addresses human needs for purpose beyond materialism, countering revolutionary threats with transcendent nationalism. Nonetheless, this elevation of the state may foster hubris, leading to ethical inversions or violence, though its adaptability to crises highlights the spectrum's dialectical tensions. This analysis of fascism as a reactive metaphysical extreme prepares us for the spectrum's culminating branch, Aristocratic Imperium. Metaphysics in Politics, a philosophical exploration of ideological foundations, Part 10, the culmination of metaphysical hierarchy, Aristocratic Imperium as radical traditionalism. As fascism illustrates a modernist response to materialist threats, elevating the nation-state as a transcendent organism to combat revolutionary communism while embedding a secularized spirituality, we arrive at the spectrum's final metaphysical extreme, Aristocratic Imperium, also termed Traditional Imperium or Radical Traditionalism. This ideology, while drawing from ancient esoteric traditions, crystallized in its modern form largely through post-World War II articulations, reflecting a rational reevaluation of wartime hierarchies amid the ruins of defeated regimes. Objectively, this post-war era's disillusionment with fascism's compromises, such as its populist elements and failure to fully restore primordial order, prompted thinkers to advocate pure, supranational visions of authority. Julius Evola, a key proponent, refined these ideas in works like Men Among Ruins, which applied his earlier philosophy to political reconstruction, critiquing modernity's egalitarian drifts and proposing an elitist imperium as a bulwark against both materialist collectivism and liberal individualism. Logically, this evolution underscores the spectrum's dialectical nature. Metaphysical ideologies adapt to historical failures, intensifying transcendent principles to envision societies aligned with eternal hierarchies. Metaphysically, aristocratic imperium is rooted in a perennial philosophy that perceives reality as a great chain of being, with cosmic hierarchy mirroring eternal transcendent principles drawn from ancient traditions. Influenced by Evola's magical idealism, it emphasizes esoteric initiation where differentiated individuals achieve unity with an absolute principle through ritual and self-mastery, rejecting rationalism or democracy in favor of a solar order of discipline and virility. This foundation assumes a teleological reversion to a golden age, opposing the Kali Yuga, dark age of modern decay. It is esoteric and pagan-leaning, incorporating elements from Tantrism and Hermeticism, allowing for divine hierarchies but prioritizing metaphysical aristocracy over organized theism. This posits that true meaning derives from alignment with immutable cosmic laws, enabling societal stability through innate spiritual qualities rather than material or electoral mechanisms, though it presupposes an elite capable of embodying such transcendence without descending into arbitrary rule. Socially and politically, aristocratic imperium structures society into rigid castes, spiritual warriors and aristocrats at the pinnacle, followed by producers and laborers, based on organic preformation or inherent metaphysical aptitudes, rather than mere heredity. The ruling elite, selected through initiation and proven transcendence, wields absolute authority in a supernatural imperium, anti-democratic and organic, where individuals fulfill roles within the hierarchy for collective purpose. Governance rejects nation-states for universal elitism, emphasizing metaphysical restoration over populist mobilization. Examples are theoretical, drawing from historical ideals like the Holy Roman Empire, but Evola's post-war writings positioned it as a blueprint for resisting Allied-imposed democracy. Logically, this assumes hierarchical differentiation fosters authentic order, countering modernity's chaos. However, it rationally requires voluntary submission or initiation to sustain cohesion, potentially challenging in pluralistic or resistance contexts. A critical aspect of aristocratic imperium's distinction lies in its post-war critique of fascism, as articulated by Evola's Fascism viewed from the right. In this work, Evola evaluates Italian fascism from a traditionalist perspective, acknowledging positive elements like its emphasis on state authority and anti-materialism, while outlining several reasoned criticisms for its failure to embody true right-wing principles. Evola argues that fascism was insufficiently hierarchical and aristocratic, compromising with modern democratic residues, such as mass mobilization and plebeian elements, which diluted its elitist potential and made it too populist, rather than rooted in esoteric initiation. He critiques its totalitarian tendencies as overreaching yet superficial, lacking the spiritual depth of a true imperium, instead adopting pragmatic materialist compromises that betrayed transcendent ideals. Logically, Evola views fascism's nationalism as too immanent and state-centric, critiquing it for not being right-wing enough and restoring primordial traditions, leading to weaknesses like bureaucratic inefficiency and failure to cultivate a genuine warrior aristocracy. Rationally, these points highlight fascism's historical contingencies, such as its reactive origins against communism, as barriers to metaphysical purity, positioning aristocratic imperium as a superior, uncompromised alternative. In broader distinctions, aristocratic imperium separates from fascism by prioritizing universal esoteric elitism over nationalistic populism, viewing the latter as contaminated by modernity. Versus theocratic monarchy, it is warrior-centric and beyond organized religion, critiquing clerical mediation for passivity. Compared to traditional liberalism, it rejects limited government for absolute hierarchy, subordinating individualism to cosmic roles. From the materialist end, it opposes communism's egalitarian determinism by affirming transcendent inequalities as natural law. Viewed objectively, aristocratic imperium's logical strengths include its provision of existential purpose through hierarchical transcendence, offering a framework for cultural revival in decadent eras, as Evola's post-war vision rationally addressed Europe's spiritual vacuum. Nonetheless, its esotericism may limit accessibility, risking exclusion or stagnation if elites falter, though its emphasis on initiation provides adaptive depth. Metaphysics in Politics, a philosophical exploration of ideological foundations. Conclusion: synthesizing the metaphysical spectrum in politics. This grand exploration of metaphysics in politics, from the far atheistic materialism of anarchism and communism, through the rationalist bridges of socialism, democratic socialism, secular liberalism, and traditional liberalism, to the transcendent hierarchies of theocratic monarchy, fascism, and aristocratic imperium, reveals a logical continuum where philosophical assumptions about reality profoundly shape governance. Objectively, materialist ideologies prioritize empirical equity and human agency, fostering critiques of power that range from voluntary mutualism to revolutionary determinism, while metaphysical ones justify order through higher constructs, evolving from divine sanction to esoteric elitism in response to historical dialectics. Rationally, this spectrum underscores politics as an extension of ontology. Atheistic views risk relativism or coercion in pursuit of tangible justice, whereas transcendent frameworks offer moral anchors but may enable dogma or exclusion. By maintaining neutrality, we recognize each ideology's internal coherence and historical utility, yet also their shared challenge, balancing human flourishing with uncertainties of existence. Ultimately, understanding these foundations promotes reasoned dialogue, illuminating how metaphysical commitments, whether explicit or implicit, continue to define the human quest for societal harmony in an ever-evolving world.